One of the interesting things about white historiography, this Eurocentric historiography, it hones in always on the things that separate us. They separate us from ourselves. They separate us from our ancestors, from our history, from our families. They divide us up into little fragments. And they never tell you about the unities in struggle that took place in history. And so my historiography hones in just on this point, because the logic of the situation is that if people were oppressed, like the Native Americans were and the African ancestors were, obviously they resisted the oppression. And obviously, as intelligent human beings, it occurred to them that by uniting against a common foe, they would have greater strength in the struggle. But the histories lie there waiting generation after generation. And then I pick up the books by Boyd Thatcher, who is a great admirer of Columbus. But in those books I find that in 1502, there is a rebellion, a major rebellion, in which blacks and Native Americans joined forces. 1492 to 1502. That's 10 years. And in that time begins a struggle. And you're going to find this uniting of the oppressed threading its way through the entire history for 5 centuries. And one of the great epics of the struggle took place in, of all places, in Florida. You know, we have black studies departments all over the country, and do you know, I have seen not one single piece about this to train our children, because the way you defeat someone, you defeat them in the mind first. That's why Garvey said, first you must change your way of thinking, and then peacefully carve up the weapons with which to fight. So they assault the mind. They tell you about rebellions that Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey and Posner. But if you notice, all of them were betrayed. They didn't win. And the one great insurgency that blacks fought in this country for over 130 years is one of the best kept secrets in black history. And it took place in Florida, and you read about it as the Seminole Wars. You've heard about that, haven't you? Seminole Wars? Do you know that there's no such thing as a Seminole? Seminole doesn't exist. Seminole was a Creek word for runways. And those slaves who escaped from the Carolinas and from Virginia down through what eventually became Georgia. Georgia became a state to block the movement of escaped slaves into Florida. Did you know that? That's how they set it up, as, in quotes, a free state. And there in Florida, the blacks were called Seminoles first. The black escapees who went into Florida, who were welcomed by the Native Americans there. And there you had some of the most interesting Native Americans in the entire hemisphere. There was a group called the Calusas, and the Tequestas, and the Apalaches, and even their enemies write about them with respect, because they were some really bad Native Americans. I mean, they... When Ponce de Leon came, and you know we have at the Exploratorium a film on Cabeza de Vaca, who went with the Narvaez expedition. And interesting to see how they're going to do this film. How I learned about the resistance there in Florida is that you have to read a book by a half Native American who was related to the Inca kings. His name was Poma de Ayala. And he had oral testimony from soldiers who had actually fought in Florida. And when Ponce de Leon arrived there, he arrived like a conquistador. And I must tell you quickly how he arrived. It was the Taino pilots who showed him how to navigate those treacherous waters of the Bahamas. Bahama comes from Spanish Bahamar, the shallow sea. Then you anglicize it as Bahamas. So in there you can wreck your ships every second. And the Taino pilots, who were brilliant at navigation and at astronomy and at the science of looking at the motion of waves and judging the distances from land, which, only recently the Smithsonian had some white scholar discover that those black folks in the Pacific were navigating the entire Pacific Ocean in their catamaran boats. And they could look at the motion of the waves and the wind and tell the distances from land in that big, vast Pacific. So this is what the Tainos taught to Ponce de Leon, and he got past that Bahama current and he got to Florida. He immediately fell on the Native Americans and began slaughtering them after they welcomed him. These murderous Spanish and genocidal Spaniards. And what the Calusas did, they waited for him to come back. And then they feted, wined, and dined them for 4 days. And then they fell upon them and killed every single one. They left 6 alive, but barely alive. They wounded them so that the wound would work in enough time when they got back to Cuba to spread the word. Don't come back here. There's some serious folk here. And of course,